The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the city streets in a cold, merciless downpour. Beneath the flickering neon lights of a crumbling diner, a man sat slumped on the curb, his once pristine suit now nothing more than a tattered mess. His hands, trembling from the chill, clutched a single crumpled photo, a radiant woman smiling beside her family. But this wasn't just any man. This was Daniel Hartman, a multimillionaire whose name graced headlines, stock markets, and philanthropic galas. Yet, tonight, he looked every bit the destitute drifter, invisible to the passers-by who ignored him. Why would a man of his wealth and stature willingly sink to this state? That question haunted Daniel as much as the looks of pity or disdain he received. He wasn't here by chance. No, this was deliberate. This is the only way, he muttered to himself, staring down at the dim reflection of his worn-out face in a puddle. As he tucked the photo back into his pocket, the diner door creaked open, and a warm light spilled onto the sidewalk. A woman's voice called out sharply, "Hey, you can't just loiter here. Move along." Daniel glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. He said nothing, but something in his gaze, raw and unflinching, made her hesitate. She didn't know who he was, but she would soon, and so would her family. Little did they know, their lives, and his, were about to change forever. Who was this woman, and why had Daniel chosen this rundown diner as the start of his unusual mission? The city skyline shimmered like a crown of diamonds against the inky night. Towering glass buildings stood proud, their glowing windows a testament to ambition and success. Somewhere, near the top of one of those skyscrapers, Daniel Hartman leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the weight of the world pressing against his chest. From the outside, his life was a masterpiece of achievement. He had built an empire that spanned continents, with luxury cars, exclusive parties, and a private jet to his name. Yet tonight none of it mattered. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of an antique clock, an heirloom from a family Daniel rarely spoke of. The spacious penthouse, with its sleek lines and curated art pieces, felt strangely empty. Even the sprawling city below, alive with energy, seemed distant. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the view. A folder sat open on the coffee table behind him. Inside were photos of a warm, lively family gathered in their modest home. His fiancée, Emma, was at the center of it all, her radiant smile lighting up the image. Daniel traced the edges of the photo with his finger, his expression unreadable. Her family had invited him to visit, to finally see the life Emma had left behind. They were humble, hard-working people who valued honesty and character above all else. Daniel, with his tailored suits and carefully curated persona, knew he could never meet them as himself. "They'd never accept me," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. The idea had taken root days ago, absurd at first. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If he stripped away his wealth, his status, everything, they could meet the real Daniel, unfiltered and raw. The ticking clock echoed louder in the silence as Daniel's decision solidified. Tomorrow, the multimillionaire would disappear. In his place, a man with nothing to his name would step into Emma's world. What would they think of him? And more importantly, would Emma's family uncover the truth before he revealed it? Daniel stepped into the small coffee shop Emma loved, a quaint place tucked away from the city's chaos. The air was rich with the scent of freshly ground beans, and the quiet hum of conversation gave the space a welcoming warmth. Yet, even here, something gnawed at him, a faint unease he couldn't shake. Emma greeted him with her usual brilliance, her arms wrapping around his waist. "You're late," she teased, her voice light, but her eyes studied him carefully. "I got caught up," Daniel replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat across from her, the edge of the wooden chair feeling uncharacteristically rigid. They talked about plans for the weekend, her family, their traditions, what to expect, but Daniel's mind wandered. He couldn't help but notice how carefully Emma chose her words, almost as if she were bracing him for something. She described her parents as kind but firm, her siblings as protective yet skeptical. "They'll love you," Emma said, though there was a flicker of doubt in her tone, barely noticeable but enough to spark a question in Daniel's mind. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "I mean, they don't even know me yet." Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hand pausing mid-reach for her coffee. "It's not about knowing you," she said slowly, her eyes meeting his. "It's about trusting you." Her words lingered in the air, sharper than they should have been. Daniel straightened in his seat, suddenly aware of how much rested on this visit. Trust wasn't built on words or wealth, it was earned, piece by piece. For a moment, Emma seemed far away, her gaze drifting to the window. Was she worried about him fitting in? Or was there something she hadn't told him? A small frown creased her brow before she forced another bright smile. "You'll be fine," she said, almost as if convincing herself. But why did her reassurances feel so hollow? What was Emma holding back? The sun dipped behind the hills as Emma's family gathered in their modest living room, the warm glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Laughter echoed through the space as her younger brother, Caleb, retold a childhood story. Daniel sat quietly, observing the ease and closeness of their interactions. Yet, amidst the warmth, an undercurrent of tension simmered just below the surface. In the corner, Emma's eldest brother, Luke, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Daniel. Unlike the others, Luke had said little since Daniel arrived, his piercing eyes watching every move, every word, as though measuring the man before him. Luke's silence wasn't indifference, it was strategy. Later that night, Luke stepped out into the cold air, his breath visible in the icy chill. He walked past the barn to a secluded spot behind the house, where the faint glow of a phone screen illuminated his sharp features. The voice on the other end was low but urgent. "He's here," Luke said, his voice steady but laced with disdain. "But I don't trust him. Something feels off." "Of course it does," the voice replied, calm yet venomous. "Men like him don't come down from their high towers for no reason. He's hiding something." The voice belonged to Caleb's business partner, Richard, a man known in the town for his charm and his schemes. What the rest of the family didn't know was that Richard had been circling their family farm like a vulture. He'd approached Luke months ago, offering a lifeline for the struggling property, on paper at least. In truth, his offer was a thinly veiled attempt to seize control of their land. Luke wasn't blind to Richard's intentions, but desperation has a way of clouding judgment. The family's financial woes weighed heavily on him, and Richard had promised a way out. Now, with Daniel's unexpected arrival, Richard saw an opportunity. "If this guy's who you think he is," Richard continued, his voice dripping with manipulation, "then he could be the answer to both our problems. You play it right and we'll have what we need to secure the deal. No one will have to know." Luke hesitated. He didn't like the plan. It felt too calculated, too deceitful. But he couldn't deny the stakes. The farm was their legacy, their home, and it was slipping through their fingers. "What if I'm wrong?" Luke asked quietly. "You're not," Richard said firmly. "Just watch him. Test him. If he flinches, you'll know he's hiding something." The call ended, leaving Luke standing in the dark, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. He turned back toward the house, his jaw tight. Inside, the family's laughter still rang out, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. As Daniel sat at the table, Emma reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. But across the room, Luke's stare bore into him, unrelenting and calculating. Would Daniel's facade crumble under Luke's scrutiny? And what role would Richard play in this web of deceit? The next morning, Emma's younger brother, Caleb, wandered toward the barn, his boots crunching against the frosted grass. At 22, Caleb wasn't the strongest or the most vocal of his siblings, often dismissed as the dreamer of the family. But his sharp mind and curious nature had always been his strength, a fact often overlooked by those around him. He had been up since dawn, restless after overhearing snippets of a hushed conversation between Luke and Richard the night before. Caleb hadn't caught the full context, but what little he'd heard had unsettled him. "Just watch him. We'll get what we need," Luke had said, his voice tense. Curiosity tugged at Caleb as he reached the barn. He noticed the heavy oak door wasn't latched properly, slightly ajar despite Luke's insistence on keeping it secured. Inside, the faint hum of a voice caught his attention. He crept forward, careful not to disturb the loose planks underfoot. Peering through a narrow gap between the wooden boards, Caleb spotted Luke pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. The conversation was heated, though Luke's tone remained controlled. "You think I don't know how risky this is?" Luke hissed. "I'm doing this for them, for all of us." Caleb strained to hear the response, but the words were muffled. He caught a name, though clear as day: Richard. Caleb's heart sank. He had always disliked Richard, a man whose charm masked a ruthless edge. "Just stick to the plan," Luke continued. "If he's hiding anything, I'll find it. But if this doesn't work..." The conversation ended abruptly as Luke slammed his phone into his pocket and stormed out of the barn, nearly catching Caleb in the process. Caleb ducked behind a haystack, his heart pounding. He waited until the heavy sound of Luke's boots disappeared before exhaling shakily. As he emerged from his hiding spot, the weight of what he'd heard began to sink in. Luke, his steadfast older brother, was working with Richard, and it involved Daniel. But why? What could they possibly gain from testing Emma's fiancé? Caleb's mind raced with questions, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. For a moment, he thought of calling Emma, but the image of her radiant smile stopped him. She was so happy, so certain that this visit would bring her family closer to the man she loved. Could he risk shattering that? Torn between loyalty to his family and the gnawing sense that something was deeply wrong, Caleb began pacing the barn. The walls, lined with tools and weathered memories, seemed to close in on him. He needed to act, but how? Confront Luke? Warn Daniel? Or stay silent and hope he was wrong? In the corner of the barn, he noticed a small black folder Luke had left behind. Caleb hesitated before picking it up, flipping through its contents with trembling fingers. Inside were documents, maps of the farm, legal paperwork, and notes scrawled in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. One sentence stood out, bold and underlined: leverage the outsider, force his hand. Caleb's stomach churned. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and Daniel was at the center of it all. His brother wasn't just testing Daniel. He was setting him up for something far more dangerous. Would Caleb risk everything to expose the truth, or would his hesitation cost them all? Caleb gripped the folder tightly, the edges cutting into his palms as his mind spun in circles. Every instinct told him to run straight to Daniel and lay it all out, to warn him about the trap being set. But with every imagined step toward the house, his legs felt heavier, his resolve weaker. What if he was wrong? Worse, what if he was right? How could he confront Luke, his own brother, knowing the fallout it might cause? He slipped the folder into his jacket and made his way back toward the house, but every sound, every rustling leaf, every crunch of gravel beneath his boots, felt amplified, a warning that he was out of time. As the house came into view, Caleb froze. Through the kitchen window, he saw Luke sitting at the table, his posture rigid as he talked with Emma. She was laughing at something he said. Her face lit up with trust and affection. How could he break that? How could he tell her that Luke, the brother who'd always protected them, might be leading her fiancé into a trap? The words sat heavy on Caleb's tongue, unspoken but urgent. Instead of walking inside, Caleb veered toward the side yard and circled around to the barn, where he could think without anyone noticing his unease. His breaths came shallow and quick as he paced the wooden floor. He knew he had to act, but the weight of it paralyzed him. "Come on, Caleb. Think," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He pulled the folder from his jacket and flipped through it again, searching for answers, or perhaps for a reason to believe this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But the evidence was clear. The maps, the notes, the single phrase that kept echoing in his mind: leverage the outsider. It wasn't just a harmless test, it was a setup, a calculated move to force Daniel into something he might not recover from. Caleb couldn't let that happen. But how could he intervene without destroying everything? A loud creak broke his frantic thoughts. Caleb spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was Daniel, standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You all right, Caleb?" Daniel asked, stepping inside. His voice was calm, but his presence only heightened Caleb's anxiety. "Yeah, fine," Caleb lied, shoving the folder behind a hay bale. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just needed some air." Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." For a moment, Caleb considered blurting out everything. About Luke, about Richard, about the plan, but the words caught in his throat. If Daniel didn't believe him, it could ruin everything. Worse, if Luke found out Caleb had betrayed him, the family might never recover. "Yeah," Caleb finally said, his voice quieter now. "Just a lot on my mind." Daniel nodded slowly, though his gaze lingered. "Well, if you need to talk, I'm here." He smiled, a genuine, kind smile that only made Caleb feel more conflicted. As Daniel turned to leave, Caleb's chest tightened. He was running out of time. Every moment he hesitated brought the plan closer to unfolding, but his fear of what might happen if he acted was just as overwhelming. Would Caleb's hesitation doom Daniel, or would he find the courage to risk everything before it was too late? The tension in the room was palpable as Daniel stood in the middle of Emma's family's living room, his jaw tight and his gaze sharp. The warmth and laughter that had defined earlier moments were gone, replaced by a chilling silence. Caleb stood at the edge of the room, his fists clenched as he watched the scene unfold, his guilt growing heavier by the second. "Luke," Daniel said evenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What is this about?" Luke leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. He didn't flinch under Daniel's gaze, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Hesitation, perhaps, or guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about," Luke replied, his voice steady but laced with defiance. Daniel raised an eyebrow and held up the black folder Caleb had found earlier. "Then maybe you can explain why this was hidden in the barn. Notes, plans, all pointing to one thing. Someone's trying to set me up." Emma's eyes darted between Daniel and her brother. Confusion and fear etched across her face. "Luke, what's going on?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Luke's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do," he said finally, his words measured but firm. "For the family." Emma stepped closer, her voice rising with disbelief. "For the family? What are you talking about? What could possibly justify this?" Luke's composure cracked, his frustration boiling over. "You wouldn't understand, Emma. You've been out there, living your perfect life with no idea what it's like here. The farm is falling apart. We're barely holding on. And then he pointed at Daniel. Walks in here with his money and his secrets, acting like he's one of us." Daniel's face darkened, but his voice remained calm. "You think I'm here to take something from you?" Luke scoffed. "I don't know why you're here, but I wasn't about to wait and find out," Richard said. "Richard," Emma interrupted, her voice now trembling with anger. "You're working with Richard? The man who tried to scam Dad out of his land?" Luke hesitated, the weight of her accusation hitting him hard. "He offered a way out," Luke said quietly. "He promised he could help save the farm. But we needed leverage, something to make sure he'd follow through." Caleb, unable to stay silent any longer, stepped forward. "Luke, stop. You don't know what you're doing." All eyes turned to Caleb, who now stood shaking but resolute. "I heard everything," he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "Richard doesn't want to help us. He wants to take everything. He's been lying to you, using you, and now you're putting Daniel in the middle of it." Luke's face twisted with a mix of anger and regret. "And what was I supposed to do, Caleb? Let everything fall apart? Watch Mom and Dad lose the farm? We didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Caleb snapped, his voice rising. "But this isn't the way." Daniel took a step forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I understand the pressure you're under, Luke, but let me be clear. I'm not your enemy. I love Emma, and I came here to be a part of this family, not to take anything from you." Luke faltered, his resolve wavering. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the wall clock. But then, a sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile quiet. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Emma's mother moved to answer it. When she opened the door, Richard stepped inside, his slick smile immediately filling the room with tension. "Well, this is quite the gathering," Richard said smoothly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Daniel. "I see you've been doing some investigating." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And I see you've been pulling strings from the shadows." Richard laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Strings? No, my friend. Just facilitating opportunities. Isn't that right, Luke?" Luke looked away, shame washing over him. Emma stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Get out of this house, Richard. Whatever you think you're doing here, it ends now." Richard smirked but didn't move. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Not until we settle a few things." He turned to Daniel, his tone shifting to something darker. "You want to play the hero, but I know your type. Flashy suits, big promises, but when it comes down to it, you're just as ruthless as the rest of us." Daniel's expression didn't waver. "You don't know anything about me." "Oh, but I do," Richard replied, his voice dripping with malice. "I did my homework. Your wealth, your connections. It all comes with strings, doesn't it? I wonder what Emma's family would think if they knew the real you." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You don't scare me, Richard." For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. Then, Emma stepped between them, her eyes blazing with anger. "Enough!" she shouted. "This stops now. Whatever you're trying to do, Richard, you won't win." Richard's smile faltered, and he glanced around the room, realizing the tide was turning against him. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice venomous. "All of you." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The room remained tense, the echoes of Richard's threats lingering in the air. Luke sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Emma walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Luke. Together." Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family. But no more secrets. No more lies. As the family began to pick up the pieces, one question lingered. Had they truly seen the last of Richard, or was the danger far from over? The family gathered in the kitchen that evening, their faces illuminated by the warm light of the single overhead bulb. Despite the tension hanging in the air, there was a shared determination among them. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but charged with urgency. "We can't let Richard get away with this," he said, scanning their faces. "He's banking on us being too afraid to fight back. But if we hit him where it hurts, we can stop him." Caleb, holding the black folder tight against his chest, nodded. "We've got everything we need. His plans, his demands, it's all here. But we need more than just papers." "Agreed," Emma said, her voice firm. "He's been bullying this family for too long. It's time someone stood up to him." Daniel's eyes softened as he looked at her, pride flickering in his expression. "Exactly. We need him to incriminate himself, to say, in his own words, what he's planning. That's how we win." Luke shifted uncomfortably in his chair, guilt still etched into his features. "I'll help," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can fix what I've done, but I can help make this right." Daniel nodded, offering a small but genuine smile. "We're stronger together. Let's do this." The next afternoon, Richard arrived at the farm, his confident swagger filling the driveway like an unwelcome storm. The family had invited him back under the guise of negotiation, a chance to smooth things over. But this time they were prepared. As he entered the house, Richard's eyes scanned the room, his smirk widening. "I knew you'd come to your senses," he said, taking a seat at the dining table. "So, what's the offer?" Daniel sat across from him, calm and composed. "We just want to understand what you're after," he said. "Lay it all out for us. No more games." Richard leaned back, his grin turning sharper. "What I'm after? Simple. This farm is worth more than you realize, and with the right agreements, I can turn it into something profitable. You get a cut and everyone wins." "And if we refuse?" Emma asked, her voice steady but cold. Richard's smile faded, replaced by a harder edge. "Then you lose everything. I'm the only chance this family has, and you know it." Caleb, hiding just outside the room with his phone recording the conversation, clenched his fists. The tension in the air was suffocating, but Daniel didn't flinch. "You're pretty confident for someone who's built this scheme on lies," Daniel said, leaning forward. "What happens when people find out what you've done?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "No one's going to find out. You don't have the guts to fight me." Emma stepped into view, her phone in hand. "Actually, we do," she said, hitting a button to replay his incriminating words. The recording echoed in the room, sharp and undeniable. Richard's face drained of color. You can't use that." "We already have," Daniel said, standing. "The evidence is with the authorities now. It's over." Richard's bravado crumbled. He rose from his seat, his movements jerky. "You'll regret this," he spat before storming out, his threats ringing hollow in the wake of his defeat. As the door slammed behind him, the family let out a collective breath. Caleb stepped into the room, holding up his phone triumphantly. "We got him," he said, a grin breaking through his usual quiet demeanor. Emma hugged him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Caleb. We all did." Daniel looked around the room, his gaze resting on each of them. "This isn't just a win against Richard," he said. "This is a win for this family. Together." For the first time in weeks, a sense of peace began to settle over the house. The immediate threat was gone, but the bond between them had grown stronger as the family celebrated their triumph. One lingering thought remained. Would Richard truly stay gone, or was this just the beginning of a larger battle? The morning after Richard's departure, the house was quiet, save for the faint creaks of the wooden floorboards and the soft hum of wind against the windows. The tension that had once filled every corner had dissipated, but the scars it left behind were unmistakable. Daniel stood by the kitchen window, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, staring out at the frost-covered fields. His reflection in the glass looked tired, older somehow. Emma approached quietly, wrapping her arms around his waist. You've been standing here for a while, she said gently, her voice breaking the silence. I just needed a moment, Daniel replied, his voice low. He turned to face her, his eyes clouded with unspoken thoughts. I keep replaying it in my head. What could have happened if we hadn't stopped him? How close we came to losing everything. Emma placed a hand on his chest, her touch warm and grounding. But we didn't, she said firmly. We stopped him. Together. Daniel nodded, but the weight of the betrayal lingered. Your brother, he said, pausing as the words caught in his throat. He didn't just hurt me, Emma. He risked everything. For all of you. Emma sighed, her gaze drifting to the living room where Luke sat slumped on the couch, his head in his hands. He thought he was protecting us, she said softly. He's not perfect, but he's family. Daniel's expression softened, but the sting of Luke's actions was hard to shake. Family doesn't do that, he said after a long silence. Family stands together. In the living room, Luke remained motionless, his thoughts a storm of regret and shame. Caleb sat across from him, fiddling with the edge of a cushion, trying to find the right words. You messed up, Caleb said finally, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't accusatory, but honest. Big time. Luke glanced up, his eyes bloodshot. You don't think I know that? He snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. I was trying to fix everything. I thought. You thought wrong, Caleb interrupted, his voice firmer now. But that doesn't mean you can't make it right. Luke leaned back, his shoulders sagging. How? How do I fix this? I betrayed all of you. You start by owning it, Caleb said. Completely. No excuses. Then you help rebuild what you tried to tear apart. Luke looked away, the words hitting harder than he'd expected. I just wanted to save the farm, he whispered. Caleb stood and walked to the window, staring out at the same frost-covered fields that Daniel had been lost in earlier. So did I, he said quietly. But I didn't throw anyone under the bus to do it. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, the table quieter than usual. Emma's mother broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. We've been through a lot, she said, her hands clasped tightly on the table. And we're going to get through it, but we have to do it together. Luke glanced at Daniel, then at Emma, his guilt evident. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For all of it. Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding. I believe you, he said, but trust isn't given back easily. You're going to have to earn it. Luke swallowed hard, nodding. I will. The table fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was quieter, gentler. A sign that, while wounds remained, the first steps toward healing had been taken. Later that night, Daniel sat outside on the porch, the cold air biting at his skin. Emma joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Do you regret coming here? She asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. No. I've learned more about family in the past week than I ever have. The good, the bad, all of it. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. Families aren't perfect, Daniel. We fight, we hurt each other, but we also forgive. It's messy, but it's real. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. I'm starting to see that. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, the stars above them glittering in the dark sky. The immediate threat was gone, but the road to fully mending what had been broken would take time. Yet, for the first time in days, there was hope as the frost began to melt with the sunrise. The question remained. Could they truly rebuild their trust? Or would the shadow of betrayal linger longer than they expected? The soft golden light of dawn spread across the farm, bathing the fields in a warm glow. The frost that had clung stubbornly to the grass was finally giving way, melting into shimmering droplets. Inside the house, the mood mirrored the changing landscape. Still tender, but brighter, hopeful. Daniel stood in the kitchen, watching as Emma laughed with Caleb over something trivial. The bond between them was natural, effortless, and it reminded Daniel of what he'd been seeking his entire life. Not wealth, not status, but connection. This family, with all its imperfections, had something he had never experienced before: resilience. Luke entered the room hesitantly, his usual confidence replaced with quiet humility. He carried a small wooden box, its surface worn and familiar. Clearing his throat, he stepped closer to Daniel. Hey, Luke began, his voice uncertain. I wanted to give you something. Daniel turned, eyebrows raised. What's this? Luke handed over the box. It was Dad's, he said, glancing at Caleb and Emma. He used to keep it in his office, his way of reminding himself why he fought so hard for this place. I think it's only right that you have it now. Daniel opened the box carefully. Inside was a single photograph of the family, taken years ago when Emma was still a teenager. Beneath it was a small key, tied with a piece of faded string. He looked back at Luke, emotion thick in his throat. Are you sure? Daniel asked softly. Luke nodded. I've spent so much time trying to fix things my way, thinking I had all the answers. But you? He paused, his words coming slower now. You didn't just stand by when things got hard. You fought for us, for this family. And I see that now. Daniel closed the box, his grip firm but gentle. Thank you, he said, his voice steady. I didn't come here expecting this. I didn't even know if I'd be accepted. But you've all given me more than I could have asked for. Later that day, the family gathered outside near the barn. It was Caleb's idea, a way to start fresh with a small celebration. Emma brought out a plate of cookies, while Luke and Caleb hauled out old chairs to form a circle. Even their mother, usually reserved, had a smile that stretched wide and genuine. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel sat back, watching the scene unfold. Caleb was joking with Emma, their laughter infectious, while Luke leaned against a fence post, finally at ease. The fractures in the family were still visible, but they were healing together. Emma joined Daniel, resting her hand on his. You've done so much for us, she said quietly. I don't think you realize how much you've changed things. Daniel looked at her, a rare softness in his eyes. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. She smiled, leaning into him. Well, maybe, but you showed us something we didn't know we needed. A way forward. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daniel stood and raised his glass of cider. To family, he said, his voice clear and filled with conviction. To forgiveness, and to moving forward. The others raised their glasses, their smiles wide and unrestrained. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter, their steps toward the future filled with promise. As the night fell and laughter continued to echo across the farm, it became clear. The bonds they had reforged were stronger than the betrayals that had tested them. The hero was no longer an outsider, he was one of them. The story of Daniel and Emma's family is a testament to the power of forgiveness, resilience, and unity. It reminds us that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, love and trust can prevail when we choose to stand together. Courage isn't just about confronting threats. It's about owning mistakes, making amends, and building bridges where walls once stood. This family's journey shows that redemption is possible, and the bonds we share are stronger than any challenges we face. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of courage and redemption. Join us as we explore the lessons that bring us closer together, one story at a time.